Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Policy and Accountability Committee. We've got a real treat for everybody who's watching on YouTube this evening. In the spirit of the adventure film, the Avengers films, where Batman and Spider-Man come together to fight crime together, we've got a joint committee meeting of the Finance, Commercial Revenue and Contracts and Public Services Reform, Policy and Accountability Committees. An appropriate analogy because when I think about our PAC members and our council officers, superheroes really is the word that springs to mind. I'll be co-chairing this meeting with Councillor Rowbottom, very much the Superman and Wonder Woman of local government scrutiny. But before we kick off, I had a couple of quick housekeeping points. Firstly, remember this is going out live on YouTube, so if your camera is on, assume that you're being broadcast to the nation and try not to pick your nose. If you're not speaking, can you please mute your microphone? That just means that people watching don't get inundated with lots of different noises. Please wait for the chair to call you before speaking so that we're not speaking over each other and the camera doesn't keep flicking between people. And if you'd like to speak, if you can, please use the digital raise hand button because I won't be able to see everybody on my screen. If we've got officers, external guests and observers, please could you introduce yourselves to the committee before you speak for the first time? And can you please avoid using the chat function as not everybody has access to it. So just by way of a brief introduction, the format for this joint meeting takes into account the current pressures on council staff and resources, as well as community partner organisations. Councillor Rowbottom and I will share the chair, and the usual business items, such as minutes and work programmes, will be deferred to the next cycle of meetings. I'm going to start with our old favourite, apologies for absence. I don't have any apologies for absence. So we'll move on to the roll call and declarations of interest. When I call your name, if you've got no interest to declare, can you, oh, sorry, there's another note. I'd like to welcome Councillor David Morton, who's been newly appointed to the Finance, Commercial Revenue and Contracts Committee. So congratulations, David. I'm sure you're in for a wild ride. I'll just go through the roll call and declarations of interest. When I say your name, if you've got nothing to declare, can you just say here or present? But if you do have a declaration to make, can you make it when I call you? So first up, Councillor Quigley.
Present.
Councillor Morton. Councillor Morton. Councillor Vincent.
Present.
And Councillor Johnson. Councillor Johnson.
I have seen Councillor Johnson on the call, Chair.
Ah, I see. Perhaps having a muting issue. We'll assume you're here, present and correct. Tony Boyes.
Yeah, present and correct.
Excellent. Eric Hohenstein.
Present.
Chris Littmadden.
Present.
Judith Worthy.
Present.
Councillor Cooper.
Present.
We've got Councillor Vincent again. He's we've already heard that he's here, and unless he's dropped off in the meantime, I won't call him twice. Councillor Kyan.
Present.
And Councillor Stanton.
Present.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. We also have, I'm not going to introduce everybody on the call, but we do also have with us Councillor Connell, the Cabinet Member for Public Services Reform, as well as some senior officers, including Rhian Davis, Director of Resources, and Emily Hill, Director of Finance. Now for the substantive business of the meeting, I'll hand over to Councillor Rowbottom.
Thank you very much, Councillor Ree. Firstly, I just wanted to introduce myself to anyone watching on the live stream. I'm Helen Rowbottom. I'm a councillor in Hammersmith and Fulham, and I've recently been appointed to the role of chair for the Finance, Commercial Revenue and Contracts Committee, which, as Councillor Ree mentioned, is one of the two committees which have been joined up to update this evening. And I'd like to take a moment to thank the outgoing chair of this pack, Councillor PJ Murphy, for the energy and scrutiny that he brought to the role during a very challenging financial time for local councils, and to congratulate him once again on his new role as the Mayor of Hammersmith and Fulham, in which he's already, I think we can all agree, a natural. One of the financial objectives that we have as a council is to do more with less. And one of the things I'm keen to do as chair is to develop public policy with co-optees and members of the public to work out how we're going to achieve this continuous improvement across the council, despite a continued backdrop of government cuts. We have a single item on the agenda this evening on the budget, but there's a lot to unpack and discuss within this. So I'm going to shortly hand over to Emily Hill, the Director of Finance, who will be leading the presentation this evening on the 2021 medium-term financial strategy. So Emily, over to you.
Oops, sorry, I haven't got my background on. Hello, good evening, and thank you, chairs. I'll be taking you through this evening a presentation giving you an overview of next year's budget. I'll bring it up on the screen, Chair, and perhaps you'll let me know whether you can see it or not. When I put it up on the screen, unfortunately, I won't be able to see your faces or your hands up or comments or anything like that. So perhaps, Chair, if you see any hands up and want me to pause to answer any questions, please just let me know, interrupt me and let me know. Otherwise, I will speed my way through and take any questions at the end.
Great.
Happy to do whichever. So I think before I start by setting out this year's budget, I think last year when Hitesh, the previous Director of Finance, set out this current year's budget, while he would have pointed to significant areas of uncertainty in local government finance, he and I never dreamed that we would have been in the financial situation that we have as a result of the COVID pandemic. So you will find that I will reference continued uncertainty in local government finance, and we've also tried to set out in this presentation some of the specific responses in the budget to COVID to try to give this these committees, assurance that we've made adequate provision in the budget for COVID, insofar as we can guess what's going to happen at the moment. So if you'll allow me, I'll just start with the national context, because I think it's important to understand that as we move into this current year. So this slide is quite busy, but it does show over the last 10 years reductions in departmental expenditure. The yellow lines in here show the revenue budgets, essentially, of all of the departments. And you can see here, actually, MHCLG, the department responsible for local government, has had the most significant reduction in real terms per person funding over the last 10 years. So a reduction of over 50% in local government funding over the last 10 years. So we're entering into this year after having some significant cuts to our funding this year, and a pandemic year, in fact. So this detail shows what's happened essentially to that. And you can see that even social care, where we have in recent years seen significant investment, has had significant reductions in funding, 5% since 2010. So over 10 years ago, we've had a 5% reduction in funding, but the other services actually have seen a 40% there. Government uses core spending power as a term to explain the revenue resources available to local government to spend on providing its services. As we've just seen, we've had significant reductions over the past 10 years, but we were starting prior to the pandemic to wonder and hope, I think, that what we were calling austerity was over, because we had seen, or were starting to see, increases to that core spending power by government. And you will have heard the announcements this year that there has been a core spending power increase of 4.5%, and perhaps I'll unpack that a little bit later in the presentation. But I think probably what's important to know is, although there have been those funding increases in the past 5 years, the deeper cuts in the 5 years prior to that mean that local government is still worse off, both in cash and real terms, compared to 2010-11. So we're working with less money, essentially, than we were in 2010-11, 10 years ago, despite the impact of inflation. And a graph really on the UK economy and the impact of COVID, and this will have, I think, a number of implications for local government as we go forward. As we saw in 2008, 9-10, austerity starting to bite after government was sort of coming out of or going into its recession. Public spending started to need to reduce. Local government particularly had to find significant savings, and we can see that. So the backdrop to those cuts 10 years ago now were the result of a recession, and we know COVID now is likely, or has put us indeed, in another recession. And so that's got implications for public sector funding, but it also has significant implications for public sector and local government service demand, because we will see increases in demand as the recession and the economic downturn hits our communities and our businesses. So really, this is saying this was our previous forecast of the UK economy, and it's going to take a long time really to get anywhere near where we thought we were going beforehand. So it's just a backdrop really for what we're looking forward to in the future. So in that national context, our local context is in order to meet our reductions in funding, we've had to find significant savings and growth over that last 10-11 years. And you can see the darker blue here is the savings, value of savings that we've identified, and the blue is the growth or the investment we've needed to put in the budgets to meet in the large demand pressures, largely in recent years in relation to social care. So you can see actually demand and needing to fund social care budgets increasing, and us also having to find savings to offset that growth. One of the biggest resources available to the council tax to provide its council to provide its services is council tax. LBHF council tax is the third lowest in the country and significantly below the London average here. So it's just showing the difference really in relation to revenues the council's able to raise because of the difference in council tax levels. So this just really to give you an overview of where the council spends its money. And you can see if you took social care here, it's over half the expenditure of the council. The next area really being the biggest area of spend is the environment department, which provides all of those universal services to our residents. So waste, libraries, all of the services like that. And you can see previously, while there was more money in the system, there were higher levels of surpluses, really starting to feel difficult here, where we're sort of in and around break even. A particular issue last year in relation to children's demand for children's services. and this year a forecast at the moment of 7.5 million deficit. Now, 2.5 million of that relates to COVID pressures, and we also have mitigating actions in place to seek to offset that forecast overspend, although the third lockdown means it's particularly difficult for officers at the moment to continue to identify and deliver other savings whilst working on a pandemic response. And similarly, the other side of that really is our reserve balances slowly reducing, really, as we need to use those to invest in transformational services or one-off investments, or indeed to fund any in-year deficit. You will see a slight increase here between 1920 and 2021. I explain that mainly because at the end of 1920, we received a COVID grant right at the end, just as the pandemic was started, but before we'd spent significant sums in response to that. So because that's a specific grant, we have to take it into our accounts, and then we hold it in a specific reserve to spend against that requirement in future years. And as certainly the Finance Committee will know, we need to track our level of reserves, and we forecast our level of reserves. And there is a paper within the wider budget papers on our reserve strategy, which also has been discussed at the Finance Committee, and will need to come back again. We see a reduction in reserves and a planned reduction in reserves here to a low in 22-23, that then we expect to increase again 23-24, but reserves being used in a planned way, but something that we would look to be recovering in future years. So 2021 budget, this is how we are making up this year's budget. This is last year's budget. We have added a provision for inflation here in relation to specific inflation bids. A large proportion of this is on social care and reflects the fragility, really, in the social care market. Investments largely in relation to demographic pressures, but also other council priorities, so additional expenditure budgets here. Some money and activities that we think require additional funding next year because of the impact of COVID-19 and because of the significant risk around COVID-19 and the fact that we haven't been fully funded by government grant this year, an additional contingency that we've put in place to deal with COVID-19 pressures that may or may not occur next year. There is a particular one-off saving within the budget of 1.1 million, and so as a one-off saving and as agreed with the reserve strategy, we will be putting that into reserves. The net cost of borrowing essentially is a reflection of the very low interest rate environment we have at the moment, and we will be earning less interest on our investment balances. And of course, in order to balance the budget, we then need to identify specific savings to do so, and that's this figure here. Now, all of these figures, actually, you should have detail within the detailed report, and we have officers here that should be able to answer any questions on that detail if you have any. And this essentially is a breakdown departmental-wise of those figures that we've just taken you through, and also in the report. So coming to COVID then, so at the moment, and I'll talk about the 2021 position, we're still looking at about a 2 to 3 million unfunded general fund impact, about a 1.5 million pounds impact now on the collection fund, so that's business rates and council tax, because the government has now confirmed that it will fund 75% of our losses there, so that forecast is down on previously, and then about 2 to 3 million on on the HRA losses as well. So we haven't been fully funded for COVID pressures in this financial year, and so we need to ensure that we've included some provision for similar next year. We have been told that we will get a grant allocation of 6.2 million for the first quarter in 21-22, and we will expect that we will need all of that to meet additional COVID-19 cost pressures. There will also be a continuation of the fees and charges compensation scheme. Now, that doesn't fully fund our losses on fees and charges because there are two exceptions in that we first have to pay the first 5% of our loss. We have to bear, the first 5% of our loss, and then we bear 25 pence in the pound, the government reimbursing us 75 pence in the pound. I think I mentioned previously that our losses, council tax losses in this financial year are normally, because of the vagaries of local government accounting, funded the next year. Now the government have now said they will fund 75% of that, so we will fund only 25% of the losses, but we've also been required to spread those over 3 years so as not to hit the council taxpayer essentially in a lump because of the impact of COVID-19. There has been a devastating impact really of COVID-19 on business rates income, and that's devastating impact on our local businesses. I'll come onto on the next slide where there isn't particular risk in relation to the 21-22 budget, but in terms of overall funding to local government, that's a difficult issue. And as you'd expect, any shortfall that we see in government funding will need to be met either from reserves or additional in-year savings. I've also talked already about the wider economic downturn of COVID-19 and the impact that may have on our budgets. So in terms of 2021, how has that affected our budget? It has increased our budget gap to fund the collection fund losses. We've also had to reduce our expectation around council tax collection. Obviously, in an economic downturn, it's more difficult to collect council tax because people don't have as much disposable income available to them to pay their bills. So we've reduced the collection rate of council tax in our assumptions. And we've also allowed for an increase in the number of residents that claim council tax support. So residents on low income or indeed universal credit or benefits who will need to claim council tax support. And that, of course, will mean a loss in income for us. So we've factored those into our assumptions. Because at Hammersmith and Fulham, because of various historical issues in relation to business rates and business rates appeals, we've had business rates issues. We already budget on the minimum level of business rates that's guaranteed by government, the safety net. So COVID-19, although having a significant impact on our business rates and our local businesses, for budget purposes, because of this safety net, it's probably one of the most concrete numbers within the COVID-19 assumptions. We've included budget growth for particular areas which are facing immediate COVID-19 pressures, so homelessness, social care, for example, and as mentioned previously, an increased contingency budget to meet those pressures. I think I'm nearly done. One of the things that I think probably is useful to explain, because of the headlines that you will have seen in local government press or indeed the national press, is that the local government core spending power, so the money available to local government, the headline is that that's increased by 4.5%. So nationally, that's increased by 4.5%. We can sort of apply that formula and we can see the impact of that on Hammersmith here in this column, where it shows that although we received additional social care grant and a new, essentially universal services grant, we were significantly hit by changes in the new homes bonus and we lost a level of grant there. There is moving down a little bit, there is a one-off council tax support grant to hopefully fund some of that impact of COVID-19 on council tax support, and a grant to compensate councils for the freeze in business rates, because business rates won't be increased by CPI this year. So whilst government has talked about a spending power increase of 4.5 or 4 in Hammersmith, actually when you start netting all these figures off, the vast majority of that increase is through the expectation, or government's expectation, that local authorities will raise local taxes. So it expects local authorities to raise an adult social care precept of 3% and a council tax of 2% in order to reach this spending power increase that has been included in the announcements. So as I mentioned, Hitesh, as previous Director of Finance last year, would have said there's significant uncertainties over local government funding, and there continue to be them even despite COVID. So we have a 2021 spending review this year, and we need to see what the impact of COVID-19 on public finances are, and what the Chancellor essentially expects to do to pay for the expenditure that has been spent in COVID and to recover from this economic downturn. Will there be increases in taxes? Will there be reductions in public sector expenditure? And if so, where? We need to see that. And given the history of the last round of austerity, there is quite a lot of concern in the local government finance sector that we will start to be hit again. You saw that we lost significant new homes bonus this year, 1.6 million, and there is a real concern that that remaining 5.2 million could be at risk, particularly I think because there is a levelling up agenda that's sort of moving, I think, away from inner city deprived areas to more rural and potentially northern areas in terms of levelling up. So there are real risks that inner London will be hit by a levelling up agenda, which will also be included sort of within this fair funding review. Fundamental review of business rates and the impact of business rates as a key source of funding for local government. Still considerable uncertainties, and with social care, adult social care being such a large area of our budget, the proposals to reform adult social care again are a big risk, really. Just interestingly, and as an aside, given that we're in a international health pandemic, there were no changes to public health grant funding this year. Government has said that there will be a review. And so we're yet to see what happens in relation to public health funding. And that's the same, I'm sorry. So I think that's probably more than enough. Oh, I can't come off this screen now. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you very much for that, Emily. I might just ask you to mute briefly. Sorry, Emily, just getting a bit of feedback. Or don't worry, we're all good. Great. So I will now take questions on that in the order that hands are raised. So just wanted to remind people that as we're a joined pack tonight, there are obviously more people who want to speak. So please keep your questions succinct and to direct them, please, through the chair. So I see I'm going to go first to Tony. You're on mute, Tony.
Oh my goodness, that's an elementary mistake. I apologise. Yeah, thanks, Chair. Thanks, Helen. Yeah, so quickly, Emily, thanks for your presentation. Two brief questions. So firstly, I notice your projection for economic recovery is relatively muted and cautious. But I noticed from some of the financial markets are projecting the possibility of a substantial major recovery even this year. Is that a scenario that you've modelled at all? And what would the impact of a more positive recovery be on your plans?
Yeah, I think the detail of the budget doesn't, it takes into account certainly the fact that interest rates are lower, and I think our view is that interest rates are likely to stay low even in the event of a recovery for a while. In terms of other areas, it's a little bit more difficult really to predict, in that the economic downturn really could affect our demand, and we've included some increases in demand within the budget. Actually, I think those increases in demand will continue irrespective of an economic downturn. So we know that the social care market remains fragile, even in the event of a huge big bounce and a great recovery. I think the social care market, and I'm sure Prakash could tell you more, but is vulnerable essentially. So I don't think particularly any big changes in projections of a recovery will have a big impact on the budget. It's often more the sort of longer term effects of how that might feed through to sort of families needing support from us, or residents needing support. It certainly would do, very much so, if we were more reliant on business rates funding, because those businesses will be very sensitive to the economic recovery. But as I said, we currently budget on the safety net and the minimum level, and given potential challenges in the next year to the business rates and the rateable value of office accommodation and other things, which I think may continue irrespective of a recovery, I'm not sure that next year's budget would be particularly different. So I think it's quite robust either way.
Yeah, how sensitive are you to, I mean, if there's a major recovery and the demand for development and housing comes back on stream, that'll be beneficial, won't it?
Potentially in the area of planning fees and things like that, although planning fees and most of our fees and charges actually are set to recover costs, and so we'd expect to have to bring more cost in and more people in to meet that demand, and so it's not all sort of profit, as it were. Yes, and the wider recovery and business rates essentially would increase, and so there would be some benefit there. Okay,
no, it's just a possibility. I mean, so I'm looking at the my last question, Helen, the annual report 2020-21, and of course Stephen has rightly pointed out that he's managed to negotiate a marvellous £685 million from developers over the last 5 years. So a variation in that could be quite significant. And then that leads on to my last question is, as Helen started, you know, this whole theme of more for less, I think, is a very laudable one from Hammersmith Council, and Steve's particular focus on what he calls, you know, ruthless financial efficiency. So my question is on the 2021 annual report. I'm not seeing what I've seen before, which is actually a clearer picture of what the more is. So what you're getting, and you've talked about this a little bit, about the services that you buy. You know, people, if I wanted to explain to somebody in the streets, what do you get for your rates, in a very, very simple sort of way, there are concrete items like the wardens, CCTV operations, etc., that you could shake a stick at. But do we have anywhere a simple overview, for me, you know, intensely simple? What do we get? What is the more of what are we getting for the money that we spend? Is that in existence today?
Well, in terms of this year's budget, where we've put more money in, essentially would be those growth items that are set out within the budget, so all the investment items. I think for this year it's been pretty hard, and actually most of those are most of the investment, as it were, is there to invest in additional demand. So the social care demand and the costs of social care, both at adults and children's. The other areas are, as you've said, the community enforcement, where we've invested additional funds, and the gangs unit. That refers to the planning funds actually that have been negotiated by by the council. It might just be worth a word of caution in relation to potential planning reform, and those contributions may not be. We may not be as successful in negotiating those, not because we won't be successful, but because planning legislation may change that framework to allow us to obtain contributions from investors when they invest in the borough.
Yeah, indeed. I think many residents wouldn't see planning as necessarily a benefit. They see wardens and stuff. Anyway, I think that's one I'll have to park, and we'll probably have to pick up as we go forward with the new chair.
We can certainly, Tony, thank you for raising it. I think it would be good to have a sort of series. I'm thinking obviously of free breakfast, the social care offer that we have, things like that, so that it could be, clear landing page or something, because I know we've got across so many departments, we've got offers like that. So we'll take that one away, certainly. Thank you for that. I'll move on next to Councillor Vincent.
Hi, Chair. I've got about 8 questions. I don't know whether you want me to ask some now and then let somebody else have a go and come back to me. Since I'm here twice anyway.
I'll leave that at your discretion.
Well, we'll have a go and see how we get on. Emily, how are you? Nice to see you. Firstly, thank you very much for the presentation and for all the work on a very impressive piece of work. I mean, we are, you're under enormous challenges and for all the reasons you've been setting out. So anything I'm saying isn't criticism of you. It's merely trying to understand things, and so these are probably mainly pretty stupid questions. Paragraph 23 of your report, there's the categorisations, the saving proposals, categorisations. 2 questions on that. One is you've got savings there. There's a lot of euphemisms in there, obviously, because you're only trying to describe them in a couple of words. Are there any job losses in there? And if so, how many job losses do you think are involved in the savings next year?
So the areas where that would be the case are those that we have been we've referenced as staffing and productivity. I think it's difficult to say around job losses. What those will be, what those reflect, and the detail of each of those will be in the appendix for the savings. Is throughout you will see particular restructures of teams, for example, and that includes restructure in my finance teams as well as others. As to whether there will be job losses, it's not really clear. So we would say that they'll be being implemented now or start consultation. A number of those are often restructures that would remove vacant posts. So for example, I know for sure that some of my savings are removal of vacant posts. I'm just using mine as an example, but it will be the same throughout the council. But there is the possibility that within those restructures there may be redundancies. In those cases, we would look to redeploy within the council first. So there is the potential, yes, for there to be job losses. I don't expect those to be significant. As you can see here, staffing and productivity changes are 1.6 million. Not all of that is staffing, and that would first be managed through vacancy management. So there is no number that I can give you. I would expect any sort of compulsory redundancies to be limited, and where they are in place, we would ensure there are good redeployment opportunities available. But not significant. No, certainly not. In this year, there isn't a significant level of staffing savings within that.
Okay. On the same table, commercialisation and income. We've talked over the years on this committee about commercialisation. Particularly, there's been all sorts of ideas about how we sell services and so forth. And also the big one that keeps popping up is promises that we will make a lot of money out of advertising rentals. There is, I think, in paragraph 32, something which I think is saying that we don't expect to get very much because we had a presentation a couple of years ago from an officer saying we were going to make lots of money out of it. What is this commercialisation? Are we actually making much out of anything? Are we making much out of advertising revenue and so on for selling advertising space and so on?
Yeah. Let me just think about the questions. And so the first question, so I would say this year we haven't tried to focus on commercialisation in this year's budget specifically. Obviously, we've explored all opportunities, but this particular COVID environment has meant we've felt that trying to look for commercial income opportunities in this year is particularly difficult. So that's not only commercial, I think actually the majority of savings on there will have been a review of our services and whether there were any fees and charges. And I think the majority of that saving there in commercialisation income relates to a sort of review of our planning service. Rather than that sort of direct commercialisation, I think you're sort of talking about. In relation to advertising, our advertising income is over 2 million and has certainly been, well, it's not actually been hit by COVID to date. We've been taking quite a robust line on our commercial contracts, and we haven't agreed to reduce any of our contracts, although we've been asked to, although we've come to payment plans on them. So we haven't sort of lost any money on advertising contracts to date. Where it's going to be difficult for us is profit shares, and also as leases come up in this financial year, as markets are depressed, it may be difficult to re-let them at the same rates as we currently get, essentially.
You've got paragraph 32, you say there's a risk of 0.490 million to the department as the effects of COVID-19 has led to a downturn in digital advertising.
That's right, because so our market testing for our existing sites, when those leases come to an end, we are concerned that when we need to re-let them, we will not be able to get the level of income that we get now, or that the profit share sites, not all of our sites profit share, but our standard lease payments, profit share sites, there is a risk there.
And is there any other significant commercialisation going on? Because again, we've talked about it over the years, and it's always been something that we were keen to do, but I'm not sure, and particularly in the last year, obviously it's been very difficult.
Yeah. So I think still exploring opportunities where we find them. I think this financial year has been particularly difficult, so probably more on the back burner this year, but we will start again, and certainly, as Tony says, with any sort of bounce back of the economy, we'll want to be ready and looking at those options, but no particular within this budget expectations of significant additional commercial revenue, particularly because of those risks that we've just talked about.
Can I turn then to the outturn this year and the effect on reserves? There's a figure somewhere in the report saying you are worried that, well, that as at month 6, the projected shortfall in turnover this year, the current year we're sitting in, was 5.7 million. Is that right?
Yeah. That is correct. Yeah.
Although there's a load of things in Appendix 5 which seem to be saying you're hoping to get some mitigation against that, which may reduce it down to 1 million. So what's the current estimate for outturn? In other words, trading loss for the council this year, if it is a loss? Yeah,
I think the same position as we've just discussed. So that the high level, 5 to 6 million, about 2.5 of that is COVID related. We continue to review. It's really hard for me to tell you the year-end forecast at the moment.
No, the best you can,
the length of and the type of restrictions we will have, even in these last 2 months, will significantly affect the outturn. But actually, largely at the moment, we are forecasting similar to what we've reported here, 5.7 at a high level. We do still have mitigating actions, which I hope to bring that down significantly. But officers, it is true, have since the second lockdown and now the third lockdown, have been diverted somewhat from those savings and those mitigating actions, but are still making making progress on those. So we're just about to close on month 9, Councillor Vincent. So if I had another month, I would be able to give you some more detail, but I don't at the moment.
And on
I might pause. Oh, sorry. If you wanted to finish on that last point, then what I might do is rotate around some other questions and come back to any following ones you might have.
Can I just ask the supplementary on this one, which is that quick question: what in table 9? What figure have you put in for this year's loss?
Table 9, 5.7.
5.7. So that's presumably out of the 6.6 forecast movement. 6.6, presumably that's a negative 6.6. So presumably part of 5.7 is the forecast loss, and then the rest of odds and sods.
So I'm sorry, Councillor Vincent. No, I believe the 5.7 is included in the 9.3. So the risks and other potential users.
And therefore, if it goes up or goes down, obviously, then the result of this whole table moves along with it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, I'll save up the rest for later.
Thank you very much. We might rotate back to you sooner than we think. But I've got Councillor Ree next.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presentation as well, Emily. I thought that was very good and very thorough, particularly with the papers as well. You mentioned several times with uncertainty with relation to local government funding. It seems like the only certainty that we do have is that there seems to be less and less of it as time goes on. Back in July, the PSR pack looked at the impact of COVID on the council, and we had an estimate then of 38.5 million as a total financial impact in terms of expenditure and lost revenue. So I can't find a sort of headline figure of that nature in this report. Do we have a sort of a best estimate of a total sort of financial impact for COVID on the borough?
Yes. Just to clarify, Councillor V, sort of a gross impact rather than an unfunded impact. Is that what you mean? Yeah. So I think at the moment we are suggesting about 43 million impact, so about 21 million on expenditure and 22 million, and that's been about that pattern all the way through. The expenditure and income losses have been similar, strangely. So yes, about 43 million impact on the general fund and 2 on the housing revenue account. But the vast majority of that will be funded by government grant. In terms of the sort of unfunded amount at the moment, I think we're looking at a total of 2.5 million sort of on this year, 1.2 on the collection fund and 2 on the HRA. Sorry, so I'm going to add that up as I speak for 5 or 6 million unfunded impact. So, but total expenditure and income impact by the council gross is about 43 million.
Okay, and have we do we have any indication that that shortfall is going to be made up by central government, or are they still digging their heels in?
So we haven't had, it's actually a really quite complex picture and does change very quickly. The main unring fence grant has come to us in 4 phases throughout this year, and we have been notified of 1 phase of grant next year for next financial year. But the phases they get announced sort of almost without any prior notice of it, really. So it's possible that another phase of unfunded grant funding will come. I don't think we expect one, to be honest. I don't think the government's view is that it expects to fully fund our losses, because the nature, for example, of the fees and charges compensation claim, the mechanics of it are that it won't fully fund it. So it requires us to bear the first 5% of the loss, and then only funds us 75 pence in the pound. So the mechanics of that claim suggests that the government don't expect to fully fund our income losses. We do have a series of about, I think it's between 20 and 25 specific COVID grants that we're trying to keep hold of and keep track of, and there are new monies sort of being available, but they often come along with additional roles and responsibilities as well. So, for example, the testing that we have been facilitating came with money to fund that testing, but clearly we needed to spend money to support that as well. So I think we will end up with an unfunded, well, I'm pretty sure we'll end up with an unfunded loss, but it's going to be in the region of 1 to 2 million, maybe 3, 4, but not the sort of 30 that we thought at one point. I say that because I just don't know what the next 2 months are going to bring, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I mean, I just point out that if by putting up council tax by 2%, we can raise 1.3 million in order to meet this sort of unfunded extra cost that we've had to bear. That would require a pretty substantial increase if we were to try and meet it just through council tax increase, wouldn't it? Yes. So I wanted to just move on. One thing I was surprised to see not a great deal of mention of in the papers is Brexit. Presumably something that's going to have a huge impact on our forecasting and indeed the risks of the revenues that we're subject to as a council. Could you just explain briefly how you've taken Brexit into account as part of the both the modelling and then your final calculations?
Yeah, and again, it's a difficult one because at one point we were sort of modelling Brexit really in terms of the wider impact that might have on a financial downturn rather than any others. I think again, whilst we've been preparing this budget, Brexit has almost as much as COVID swung in our expectations, and we did have at one point a very significant concern that additional tariffs would cause quite significant price inflation, and to be honest, I'm still not sure what levels of inflation we might need to see as Brexit comes through. So really, I think that sort of inflationary impact will have been is picked up within inflation requests, although not very specifically or particularly. And I think there is a risk that actually inflation for some of the goods and services that we purchase will be higher than what we've made provision for, and therefore the need for our contingency budgets. Otherwise, in terms of we looked at workforce when Brexit first became an issue. We didn't think it's a particular issue for us, and in terms of our staff costs, so I don't think there's any particular issues there. I think potentially less in revenue budgets, potentially capital budgets. We may see price inflation coming through more in relation to those, and we'll need to consider those in each sort of capital business case that we consider.
Great, thank you very much, Emily.
Thank you very much.
I will come next to Chris.
Right, I'm on. Hello, Emily.
Hello, Chris.
Congratulations. I know how difficult it is to get this lot together. We've done a remarkable job. I'm not going to deal with specifics, Emily. If I could just deal with a couple of overall issues. Local government accounting has always been a mystery to me. And the way you present accounts is not the way that, this is not pejorative, normal people read things. And all I'll say to you is, if I can talk to you or somebody who you appoint, just to have a chat with you about how perhaps next year we can perhaps improve the clarity of the accounts, I'll be only too happy to do that. Number two, only once in this presentation and through all these papers has zero-based budgeting been mentioned. And to me, this whole budget is a result of what comes out of zero-based budgeting. And it would be interesting to me as a member of this committee if at some stage we could see the process of zero-based budgeting on maybe 2 pieces of paper, and to see what was accepted and what was rejected and why. Number three, I'm delighted, thrilled to bits about your cost and trend data analysis. I think it's really, really first class. And if you read those, you get a much clearer picture of what's going on in those particular departments. And I'll encourage you, please, to do more of those because they really, really do highlight where we have problems. The last one is, and this is a specific actually, page 70, appendix 5. You keep, I was looking through it, and you keep referring to, and costs are now incorporated in resident services. Because costs keep disappearing, you get not available or not applicable anymore. And I couldn't find where resident services were. Perhaps you'd like to answer sometime outside this committee. It's on cost and trend data, appendix 5.
Yeah.
Page 18.
Yeah.
And it keeps referring to resident services.
Yeah. Yes, so resident services is sort of the service name that we have for essentially our customer contact team, our housing benefit team, and our revenues and benefits teams.
No,
so,
I understand. I can understand, but where have those costs? Where do they actually appear? Sorry, where do those numbers actually appear? Because they've just disappeared off the face of the earth.
Right, I see. No, yes.
You don't have to do it now. Perhaps you can talk to me outside this meeting.
I can do that. Yes, I think essentially what we've said. I think, and I will explain outside the meeting or ask somebody to do so. But
Okay.
because we've brought an external contract in-house, essentially, they're now within internal staffing costs. But I take your point that actually it'd be useful still to be able to cost that, so we can see the value of the services that we do. So even though they're now in-house, does it mean that we still couldn't provide a comparative cost?
That's my point. Yeah,
I take it.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Chairman. Thanks, Chairman.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Chris. And we can certainly do some sort of work building in with the translating. We realise it's very, all forms of finance are specific, but there are turn of phrase, the jargon, and the way numbers are presented, and even just the finances themselves for local government are quite complex. So we can certainly do some work in making that plainer, which we can discuss after this meeting as part of our meeting cycle. So thank you for raising that. And I will come next to Eric.
Hi, sorry, Chair. I'm not sure whether this is the time that I should be asking questions, because Guy's got very specific questions to the presentation. My comments are more to do with things raised in the presentation and potentially planning responses to them during the course of the next meetings. So I think there's quite a few things in here that need a bit more unpacking. So I'm happy to come back to it once Guy's asked his specific questions.
Perfect. Yeah, no problem at all. And if it's on planning, I think we've got a second, Emily, correct me if I'm wrong, a kind of second section we're going to be looking at departments more specifically. Is that right, or have you already gone over that in the previous piece?
No, I think in general the departments have presented to their packs, but because of this is the finance and PSR pack, you see you see all of the department savings and expenditure here. So most of the packs would only have seen their particular department. Within the papers, you have got all of the departments. And so if you did have any, we don't have a specific sort of sectional presentation, but if you did have any questions on those, we do have the heads of finance for all of the departments here to be able to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, great. Thanks, Emily. I mean, Eric, I'm happy for you to go next in that case, if it's not going to come up naturally later, and then I'll come back to Councillor Vincent's point. So please feel free to go ahead.
Okay. I mean, there's just a couple of areas here. In the various papers, we have quite a lot of, and I'm not going to go into specific papers, but things like, social care. We're talking about quite a few revolutionary changes to, and investment in e-bots and this and all these quite aspirational things. We talk about commercialization. We talk about lots of things that are potentially outside of our comfort zone. Our great, again, use the word aspirational, but I'd love to understand how much the numbers are being challenged, and maybe even just get an understanding as to how some of these assumptions have been. You know, as Guy was talking about before, in some cases when we've talked about advertising income, it was sort of presented, but not really properly investigated by us to see whether or not that was going to be the case. So looking at that, you then mentioned another sort of tack. You mentioned some of the roles and responsibilities asked to assume in COVID. Again, I'd love to sort of look at whether there's a risk of some of these roles and responsibilities staying with us, like we've had in the past. We've sometimes been asked to overnight provide certain services that we hadn't really budgeted for in the past, and that whilst we had some money coming back from government, usually when those services been devolved to us as far as costs are concerned, we usually end up being worse off. So what of those roles and responsibilities might we be left with, and what might the implications be? And sort of the final sort of investigation be kind of around the Brexit piece. You mentioned the services and those service increases. Well, to what extent do we have an exposure to European price services emanating out of that, or materials and things like that coming out of this, and this is obviously something not for now. This is probably something in the third or fourth quarter once Brexit and import and exports and licenses and transportation have come up, but it's probably something to table. And then there's something within that Brexit thing again, just as we've seen, you know, the hilarious news of, or probably less hilarious, but the awful news of European British companies being told that they should set up their companies in Europe so they can trade. There is obviously European companies, if they're interested in selling to Britain, to set up in the UK. And have we looked at what types of services might be interesting as far as destination Hammersmith is concerned? And you know, what would be the types of companies that would be relocating or establishing a dependance in Britain, and what might those revenues be, and what are we doing about that as far as development of Hammersmith?
Thank you for that, Eric. I'll just it slightly fluctuated your signal, but I think we got the main gist of that, and certainly some really interesting entrepreneurial ideas in there as well, which we can possibly officers can touch on now, and if not, would be brilliant to pick up some of those ideas that you've had. So I can see that Prakash's hand went up at the social care bit, so I don't know if Prakash wants to just come in on that point, and then Emily, we can go to you to address some of the broader points. And officers, do raise hands if you've got sort of specialist knowledge that you want to pitch in with to respond. But Prakash, I'll go to you first.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. My name is Prakash Dharani. I work for social care and public health. So on the first point, I've just called yourself Eric. What comes up is we have one saving proposal in the social care line, which is to do a digitalisation. And it's not a commercial revenue stream as such, so to make that quite clear. But what we're looking at more and more with our customer cohort, and it is working with them, is to look at some basically things that we can put in their homes that makes their life a lot easier, like sensors that then are linked to some sort of central monitor. If something happens in the home, we've got a response back into that. We've already got an existing care line service, so it's expanding on that. But there is, moving along with that, there's other things on the market, particularly with providers who are coming to us, and therefore we're looking at those in terms of artificial intelligence. We haven't introduced them yet, but we are looking at things like that, which will then talk to the resident and make life a bit more, easier for them and more independent kind of thing around that. It's still at a relatively early stage, but we are definitely looking at that and have introduced it to some residents when we talk through how their home is, how their setup is, and they've liked a lot of that things. There's been some simple examples where we put some tablets in and made it a lot more easier, where they can communicate with the social workers and the management team and so on and so forth. So that's what that is, a measure of 200,000 saving in there, but that will be ultimately a reduce on the care expenditure side. It's not a commercial activity.
Thanks very much for that, Prakash. And I know from my day job that assistive tech is going to be the future of a lot of services. So that's great to hear that we're trialing some of that here. Emily, did you want to pick up some of the more general points there? And as I said, if other colleagues want to come in, please do raise your hand and I'll bring you in.
Yes, I can do. Some of them, I think, as Eric was suggesting, might be worth a sort of deep dive by the committee. But yes, just briefly, I think so. Yes, it started with robots. I was going to comment, but very interestingly, whilst we were still in the offices, we social care were even considering robotic pets. I think, wasn't it, Prakash? There was a robotic cat.
I have seen the cats. I can confirm this is true.
And so there are real movements in social care in relation to digitisation, automation, and use of new technology. So it's not. Whilst I think it's ambitious and it's keeping up with the times, I don't think it is. It's a particularly risky area. There are already things that we are doing there, and a worthwhile but moderate saving there. So we're not talking about millions of pounds. So in terms of the scrutiny, Eric, I think you were asking, and sort of how confident could we be about these? All of these savings have been reviewed and considered in that light, and that's considered, not a high risk particularly to delivery. Eric, did you want me to pause so you can come back on that before I carry on?
I think I'm sorry if maybe I got it, is the fact of, because we're looking at a lot of savings and a lot of not just the savings but also the revenue element in some quite aspirational and also some quite inventive methods, and some we're putting a lot of things that we don't know and haven't done. Now, obviously, maybe the robots and things like that. That's an easy one. You know how much it costs. The digitization. But there are other things in there. The commercial revenue. There's quite a few numbers in here where we're not quite sure. We have a good idea. We know what it will mean, but we're not 100% sure of what those savings might bring, because who knows what happens in the world. And it's just trying to understand to what extent you stress tested those numbers, because numbers have come into the committee before, and those numbers or approach hasn't worked. Yes. And understanding those risks going forward would be quite helpful.
Yeah, and so I think I would say, yes, I agree with you. And in the past few years, we have had to respond to that, where we've had some particularly ambitious saving, particularly around commercial, where we have had to say, look, we don't think we had the detail behind that, and we had to sort of rebase the budgets on those. So I think actually we've taken a lot of the risk in the last 2 years out of the budget in relation to that. We recognise that we'd perhaps been ambitious without the detailed plans behind them, and so we rebased the budget in the last 2 years. I would actually say that in this last 2 years then, and Chris mentioned it earlier, the work that we've been doing in ZBB has, as well as the other work that we've been doing, we actually do have more confidence in all of these savings figures, and there are quite detailed plans behind them. They're not just aspirational numbers, they have more detail behind them. So I think we've learned the lesson from that, but you're quite right to have raised it, because that was certainly where we were.
Emily, sorry, I know I shouldn't be, but yeah, I'm talking about the revenue as much as the savings, because actually, we should be focusing. We want to focus even more on the revenue rather than the savings.
And you're absolutely right, that is what we want to do. But I think what you'll find in this budget is we've had to be rather prudent on increasing revenue because of the particular environment with COVID-19. So in fact, within this budget, you won't see significant increases in income, certainly something that we will be focusing on in relation to setting the next 22-23 budget. But given the economic position, you won't see within this budget significant additional revenue because of the economic environment and the risk of achieving it. Is you're right, it's not a saving, but we class it within savings additional revenue. If that provides you any more comfort, I think that this budget isn't reliant on significant additional income this year.
Thanks for that, Emily. Eric, did you want to come back on that, or is that something that we can possibly pick up?
No, I mean, as I said, most of my comments are more if we're thinking the next kind of 9 months, 12 months, whatever it might be, and putting things in. They're more about looking at items and doing maybe potentially more of a deep dive, or just understanding those items a bit more as we go forward and prepare for the next cycle. And part of that is also potentially, once we're out of this immediate pressure point, that potentially instead of looking at a medium term in February next year, of actually looking a bit more at the finances in the upcoming preparation of the budget in, say, October, November, and look at these items a bit more.
Great, thanks, Eric. That's a good suggestion. Let's definitely pick that up. And I think that we'll need to reflect, obviously, with so much contingency, we might need to reflect in these meetings or between how we're reviewing some of that contingency. And we can definitely talk about that because things are in such flux. So it's a good point to raise, definitely. I'll come next to Councillor Quigley.
Thanks, Helen. Hi, Emily. Lovely to see you. And thank you for doing the report. I guess it's safe to say it's been a bit of a strange year since 2020 and up to this year. And I just kind of wanted to make a comment because I think what Eric was talking about high tech, I think it's really important that we move forward with this. I know there's a high cost involved up front, but I remember, and you might remember, Emily, when we moved into Shortlands, and it seems a long, long time ago now, and I heard the term hot desking. That was the term I heard, and I had absolutely no idea what it meant until it was explained to me. And I thought it was very strange at the time that members of staff were able to move about with their laptops. But fortunately, because of this terrible pandemic and the dreadful loss of life, and what members of staff have had to go through, the residents, it's just been terrible. Thankfully, we as the council, after maybe some initial hiccups, have been able to carry on with services. Yeah. I mean, it's just amazing. And I do remember sitting on a previous committee with PJ, with Veronica, and we were doing, she did a report on computers, and I remember saying to her, it was fantastic. Little did I know, a few months down the line. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is, I would very much support the high-tech future. Me as personally, as a councillor, I've been able to continue my job, communicating with the outside world, because I've been isolating at home. But also, I would strongly encourage that there always still has to be a face-to-face customer service base, that our residents can go in and speak to people in the council. But I would also ask that there's training and support given within the community, because there's no point in investing in all this high-tech equipment and whatever is out there without us then supporting the community and giving proper training. But I definitely think it's the way forward. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Councillor Quigley, and no doubt that training is got to be sort of the two train tracks running alongside each other of implementing any of this, so that we don't widen any health inequalities inadvertently there, but thank you very much for that point. I will come to Councillor Cooper next.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you, Emily, for your report, and apologies to Guy. He is being shoved further down the list. It's not intentional, Guy. I just had a very quick question. You showed a graph of the of reserves, which decline until I think 2023, at which point they start increasing. Is that due, so I know I keep asking this question, but is that due to the expected revenues from the civic campus?
Yeah, that's right. So essentially, as part of the civic campus, as Councillor Quigley has said, we've needed to move out to Shortlands and Clockwork building. Sorry, I live opposite it. Works underway. So a larger portion of that reserve use is the lease payments on those buildings whilst we're out. We do, however, we all expect to return to the civic campus, and again, to Councillor Quigley's point, we're looking at accommodation and workforce in there, and use of IT, and where the customer service, face-to-face customer service impact will be on there. And when we get back and we stop paying these lease payments, you're quite right, as a result of the scheme, the civic campus scheme, there will be a profit redistribution from the joint venture, which will then go back into reserves to fund that use that's happened over the last few years.
So whatever happens with the rest of the civic campus, the fact that the council will relocate back into that building means that you're making a saving on the rent you're paying at the moment.
It will. I mean, that rent paying isn't within the base budget, essentially, because we didn't used to have rental costs when we were previously in the town hall. So those rental payments are being met by reserves rather than from an increase in the base budget. But we will, as soon as we can relocate from there. There are clear break clauses within those lease contracts to enable us to move back as quickly as we can and stop paying those lease payments.
And just quickly then, has COVID delayed the work on the civic campus?
That's not the case at the moment. We did have a meeting the other day on that. The programme's still on track and in line with the initial plan. There has been some, my understanding, and I'm sure the project director would be able to tell you a lot more, there has been some reprofiling within the timescales, but we're still within the overall programme.
Okay, so that's good. So you should then still be expecting to make those savings in 2023 then.
Yeah, and that viability model that enables that profit has been continually reviewed, has been reviewed as well in light of potential changes to the sort of office accommodation and residential market, and there is still a strong confidence that profit is achievable. So that model and that viability model hasn't stood still since we made the decision, gosh, 2 years ago now. That has been reviewed, and we're still confident of that level of profit distribution.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much. I will come to back to Councillor Vincent and then on to Councillor Stanton in that order, if that's all right, just because Councillor Vincent's been waiting for a while now.
Sorry, Councillor Rowbottom, if I could just be a bit rude. My question is actually a follow-up to Councillor Cooper's.
Oh, no
problem. It's very short, yeah. So if you don't mind, Councillor Vincent.
Of course, no problem.
It's just about the effect of COVID on the civic campus redevelopment, but also on the leases that we currently have for Shortlands and Clockworks. I was just wondering, given obviously we don't have the same number of council officers working in the offices, whether A, there was any reprofiling that's being done for the civic campus development going forward, but also if there are any potential savings either being realised or potentially realised on the leases that we currently have for Shortlands and Clockwork.
I'm not sure I understood your first point, Councillor Stanton. Could you perhaps just explain it to me in a different way to make sure I'm answering the right question?
So for the civic campus, just wondering if there are any long-term changes to the kind of on-site staffing requirements that we might have, and if there have been any kind of reprofiling of the redevelopment because of that.
Okay, so we haven't changed the development or the plans in relation to the Civic Campus, but there is quite a significant piece of work being undertaken around the return of the workforce to the Civic Campus and of our corporate accommodation more broadly. So whether there can be any consolidation of estate to free up other buildings or come away from other leased accommodation or free up other parts of our buildings to lease elsewhere. So there's a wider review of accommodation at the moment, including that profiling of staffing, Councillor. So that's work in progress, I would say, at the moment. It's not complete, but certainly on our radar, particularly to pick up from the learning from COVID. I think, as Councillor Quigley said, we still expect people to be going back into the offices to use offices to collaborate and for face-to-face contact. But the model may be slightly different because we know that we're able to work from home now. I don't think we're expecting everybody to continue to work from home full-time as they are now, but we may well have more working from home, which leads to a wider accommodation review. Similarly, that accommodation review is taking into account short-term opportunities. So in relation to the Clockwork and Shortlands leases, we do have opportunities in there to sublease, and we have break clauses as well, so that we can get out as soon as possible and as soon as we can move into our new civic accommodation. So we are looking at possibilities and opportunities to sublease because of a lesser need necessarily for that floor space that we have. As you can imagine, potentially difficult in this environment where lots of people are working from home, but there are some actual definite opportunities that we are looking at the moment, but nothing that we've got we're anywhere near to sort of being able to come for a decision on, but certainly both within our accommodation work stream.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair, and apologies, Councillor Vincent.
It's a very good point, actually, to yours and Councillor Quigley's, because obviously the future of work is now radically affected. So it's one of the things that Councillor Ree and I discussed, maybe having a joint item or some sort of joint pack on what that means, you know, for COVID finances and for the Civic Campus and the council, because it's actually, you know, got some possibly really interesting implications for workforce hiring and all sorts of things, really. So it's definitely a meaty subject we'd like to come back to. So very good suggestion, thank you. And I will return to Councillor Vincent as the sort of forensic bookends of our discussion. So Councillor Vincent.
That's very kind. No, there's no problem. It breaks it up. I just wanted to ask about three different issues, although one of them has just been overtaken since my colleagues have actually stolen most of my questions about the Civic Campus. So that saves you some time. The Civic Campus, a wonderful idea, a great thing, and indeed you can see a projection of it behind me if you're lucky.
Yes.
Emily, it was good that you were able to be so positive about the Civic Campus and how everything's on track and the 11 million joint venture profit is going to be coming into our coffers and go straight into the reserves in a couple of years. Paragraph 27 of your report says there is substantive risks. One of the substantive risks which we've got to think about when we're talking about risks most of this evening is the impact on the economic downturn on the Civic Campus. What did you have in, you've just been extremely positive. You said there's no problems with it. It's all going to be on time. We're going to get the 11 million return. Everything's going to be wonderful. And similarly, about 6 months ago, when we had the last report on it at the Finance Committee, the officers then dealing with it were also extremely positive. They said, no, prices are all going up, values are going up. We're going to get the cinema in. We're going to get to all the commercial properties sold off at the value we need. We're going to sell the houses at the value we need. And so you're saying you're absolutely confident, but you've said in your report that it's a substantive risk.
Yeah, well, I think there are always risks, and with large scale capital schemes, there will always be risks. I think in the most cases it will depend on sort of at which point. I mean, I think what we mean there is we've said major council projects such as Civic Campus and Ed City development, and I think what we've meant is sort of major region projects and what sort of potential costs we might incur on those. In fact, in relation to Civic Campus, because we have entered into the construction contracts already, risks in relation to inflation now are borne by the contractor. So it will depend at what stage each regeneration project essentially is as to what the level of risks in that will be. I think it would be... the
biggest risks are going to be obtaining the value that we need in order to sell the housing and to get the long leases on the various commercial, because we've guaranteed all the commercial aspect of it by buying it in.
Yes.
And so if we don't get the leases at the right price, I suppose that doesn't actually come off the profit, does it? Because we just paid for it, and we'll be doing that we'll be taking that risk outside of the joint venture.
That's
So
right,
that
but it is still a risk of the project and our ownership of those assets. You're right, but it wouldn't affect the profit, because essentially the profit will have been looked into the JV.
We've kind of guaranteed.
I would say that if I took the example of Civic Campus, then yes, there are risks of that, and as a result, we've looked at mitigations. So very much so, as COVID came about, I think we took advice and we looked at the layout of the office and how the office would be set up. And my understanding is that there have been changes, and other people will be much better able to explain than me, but changes to floor plates and things like that, which has meant that the space is going to be much more flexible, so that if the future of work is collaboration space rather than desk space, that office has been redesigned or the design amended to mitigate against some of those risks, market risks essentially. And there are other exit plans or alternatives that we might need to consider. So yes, there are risks. There are also mitigation plans, and Civic Campus, particularly being one of the most advanced of our major projects, has very detailed governance and risk management arrangements in place.
I presume it's something we need as a committee to keep an eye on.
Yeah.
Can I go to table 9, the reserves? In your presentation, you produced a slide which had reserves presented slightly differently, which was a line of ups and downs, and the figures were different because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, on the slide, each of the total figures for the reserves over the coming years included weren't, for the sake of argument, 39.5 in the coming year, but were more than that because you'd added in the 16.6, which in the table 9 you've just presented as a bottom line.
Yeah.
Am I right in thinking you've just added 16.6 to all of those figures, so you've effectively put 16.6 into the reserves?
That's exactly right. The reason why it's shown slightly differently here is, of course, and as certainly the finance part of this joint committee is aware, there are significant restrictions essentially on those developer contributions, and that they must be used in line with those development agreements. So
that's what I was coming to.
Yeah. So that's why it comes out of here.
Isn't this sounds a bit like double accounting to me? We had a report, we have regular reports on the Section 106 monies. We've got about 50 million sitting in the bank. But as we are told, for obvious reasons, Section 106 money by definition is given to us for a specific purpose. Sometimes it's rather broad, but it tends to be allocated. So can we explain how are we able to move that 16.6 into reserves? Is it cash? Is it allocated anywhere? Is it actually, because can it be a reserve if it's already been allocated in another part of the accounts for whatever it may be, building a roundabout at some point? Or is it real money? Are we taking it out the 50 million, or are we taking it out of the notional money, which may or may not come in depending upon whether the project goes ahead? Tell us a little bit more about the 16.6. How does that get in here?
Yeah. So we account for Section 106 in different ways, depending on the agreement, essentially. So when we believe that we've met the terms of the agreement, and then it can go to reserves, because we know that money is available to spend. There are some places in the accounts, and unfortunately Chris is going to again be one of those areas where he'll be concerned about local government accounting being different to elsewhere, where essentially when we know we still have commitments for specific purposes to use that money, we would need to keep it as receipts in advance, and so that's money shown on the balance sheet, but we can't take it as reserves, because we know we have to meet those commitments before we can recognise the income. So that 16.6 is income that we know that we have received and that we are able to spend, but it still may have a particular commitment against it. But similar, so do reserves. So for example, within the reserves, we have the Civic Campus reserve, and that is committed to spending on those lease payments, as we talked about earlier. So it's not unusual that you would have reserves but have them committed for specific purposes. If you see what I mean, it's like having a bank account, a savings account, and saying, well, I know I need to buy a car in 3 years' time, so I won't use that bit of my money because I need to buy my car, kind of thing.
Yeah, no, and I always understood that some of the reserves are committed and some isn't. But
yes.
So is this the sleight of hand? Is we've just moved some of that 15 million into it, which was, if you like, reserves anyway because it was committed to something, and now we've decided to top up our reserves by putting the 16.6 on there? Because presumably you're saying it's not actually available if we, for the sake of argument, if we got into some terrible trouble and we suffered a big loss next year, that 16.6 isn't available because it's already committed to be spent on a roundabout or whatever it may be.
That's right, but it's in line with the other reserves.
Just to say, we're getting some bad feedback, so even if it's a sort of ping of the mute, if we all go on mute until literally the moment we start speaking, that might help. But Guy, we've got some remix going on from your. There we go. Oh, brilliant, thank you.
Thank you. So yes, that I'm not adding it to reserves. That is already within our reserves balance. We've just analysed it out here just to show that there may be different commitments or requirements to spend that money, but it is no different to any other committed reserve essentially. But yes, it's not available to, if for example our COVID loss next year was 40 million, I couldn't apply that to our 40 million COVID loss.
Okay. Just a final question on reserves, and I've got one more thing, short question. A couple of years ago, we got a sort of a gentle ticking off from the auditors that our reserves weren't big enough, and we said we would increase them. Do you expect that this year the auditors are going to be happy with these reserves that you're showing us? Are we back into what may be considered a reasonable amount of reserves, bearing in mind what we just said about some of them aren't actually available? So
I think we did get a gentle ticking off in 80. What financial year am I in now? I'm in 2021. In relation to our 18-19 accounts, we did get a gentle ticking off. We have had our audit report for 19-20, and I think they were less strict. I think what they saw was, as a result of our reserve strategy, we had looked to increase our reserves, and in fact in this year's budget we had looked to increase those. So they are still, and particularly in light of Croydon, although they were at pains even at the audit committee to say we were not in the realms, anywhere near the realms of Croydon, but the reserves are required by local authorities to enable them to manage risk. But essentially they had, I think they were less strict in this year's report than they have been. And we're happy to share that with you, Councillor Vincent or the others, and you can see the comparison of the 2 years. I think the best bit of assurance that we can give you is that they're proposing an unqualified value for money conclusion, and certainly if they had any concerns, significant concerns over the level of our reserves, they would be qualifying that as they did in Croydon for the past number of years.
It's also possibly worth mentioning, Guy, that we were going to have sort of items specifically on lessons learned from Croydon and a reserves paper tonight, but because of obviously the conflation of meetings, we've had to squeeze down agenda items, but it's very much on the radar, and we'll be bringing it to the next pack, so we can have detailed discussion either ahead of that or during the next meeting. Thank you. Have you got
one last question? And then I'll leave you alone. At a previous meeting, I got a sheet here from a report on agency costs. I don't imagine you'll be able to answer me specifically these questions, Emily, so you may have to go away. Agency costs is something I obsess about. In 2019 to 20, we spent 25 million on agency costs. On this current year, we are assured at that meeting, despite the fact 75% of the budget being spent, that only 12.5 million will be spent on agency costs to the year end. Two questions. One, are we still happy that we're going to make the agency figure at 12.5 at the end of this current year? And what have we put into the budget for next year for agency costs? You may want to take those away because I don't imagine you have those figures in your mind.
I can't tell you the exact figures. My understanding is that I know that we have been making significant reductions in agency during the year. I think and actually Councillor Ree, I think within the PSR pack has had significant updates on agency and workforce during the year. We have certainly made some really good progress. I would say that
it's the report that I'm quoting from. I'm on that pack as well.
I'm sorry, Councillor Vincent. I would say that we have made significantly good progress. I think COVID has impacted on our ambition there, and my understanding is that we won't meet the 12.5 million figure this year, although we will have been able to demonstrate significant agency reductions. I mean, we have, for example, we have had to bring in agency staff as part of COVID response and other things, but we have been very strict on our agency usage, particularly our higher paid agency usage. So my understanding is we won't meet that target, but we will have made significant reductions. And I think part of the reason for that will have been our response to COVID. Secondly, your question was in relation to what have we put in the budget in relation to agency costs. Well, we don't actually have an agency cost budget. So each department and each service has a staffing budget, and it is required to manage its staffing within that budget. So it will either do that through its permanently employed staff or a mixture of its permanently employed and agency staff, if you see what I mean. So we don't have an agency budget, we have a staffing budget, of which agency will be paid from, if you see what I mean.
Rhiannon,
so do we have
sorry, go on.
For this year?
I'm sorry, Councillor Vincent.
Are we trying to limit agency costs this year, and if so, to what? Or sorry, the coming year? Yes,
we will continue to do so, because we have taken a lot of action. We will continue that action, and I think we do need to see COVID. We do need to be able to focus on COVID as well. So I think we'll see a reduction at the end of our response to COVID as well. But perhaps I think Councillor Rowbottom, you're trying to bring Rhiannon in, who I'm sure does have more information than me.
Yes, I saw Rhiannon's hand go up. So Rhiannon, did you want to come in on that?
Yes, I just wanted to say the most up-to-date position. So we have now spent, unfortunately, we've spent 13.4 million to the end of December. So we haven't made the 12.5 million target, but as Emily said, there is a COVID factor in that. But we're certainly substantial improvement than previous years, and it's continuing to go down. And there's been quite a lot of changes in December as well, so that should come down again.
Great, thank you very much.
That's okay. Can I just observe that on the 16th of November, we were assured by a couple of officers that they were going to make the 12.5, and so that was right through the COVID thing. But anyway, I'll leave it there. That's very kind. Thank you very much for your time, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Cooper, is that a hand from before, or did you want to come in with something else? A hand has gone down.
Actually,
silent response there.
Actually, wasn't it me, Chris Moden? I can't find my initials at the bottom. Can I speak?
Yes, don't worry, Chris. You were next on the list, so yes, please do.
I'll get off then. I'll come off the line.
Oh no, sorry. As in, you were after my Councillor Cooper inquiry with the silent hand down. You were next, so please do go ahead. Well,
I wasn't going to say this, but as the question of agencies come up. I don't know why we're obsessed by the cost of agencies. If they're giving value for money, let's have more, please, not less. They've got to be giving value for money, though. So I don't agree with actually reducing agency costs for the sake of reducing them. End of my sort of preaching. Number two, my real issue was listening to Councillor Quigley and several of you, and obviously being aware of what's happening in the marketplace. The way that we work is obviously crucial to the way that we will work in the future. And Chair, you've already said that there will be an accommodation review, which I think I would fully back. Can you try to be, I'm putting you on the spot, I suppose, and it's a bit unfair. Can you be a bit specific about how this review is going to be delivered and who is going to deliver it and when? Can we be clearer in our own minds?
Is this a question for me? Sorry, Chris, or for?
It is, yes, really, but of course it's open to the committee for their comments.
And an accommodation review. Sorry, what were you housing underneath that?
The way the marketplace is at the moment, we've learned a great deal about how we work, where we work, when we work, and this obviously has huge implications for ourselves. Forget the rest of the world, but for ourselves. And if we're going to have a review, who will be doing it? When will they be doing it? And what sort of time limit are we putting on this? Because it's quite crucial to our future, apart from anything else, the way we work, our future budgeting.
Certainly, I think there might be a council response to that, and I think work is already well underway to sort of review all of those aspects. I think from my perspective as a chair of this pack and Councillor Rhee as a chair of public sector reform, we just thought we would be missing a massive trick if we didn't have an item bringing in some of the council's work, working with you as co-optees and topic experts, specialists, with integrated into that the civic campus to look at the whole thing, sort of reflect on impact of COVID, but particularly on future of working and what it means for space and everything else. But I know Emily's got her hand up, and I know that council work separate to that as a sort of big broad picture thinking, some detailed work has gone on already, starting to look at that. So Emily, did you want to come in on that point, or was that what you was your hand up?
Oh,
another thing.
Sorry, I didn't realise my hand was up. It's been
fine.
No, but it's fine.
Don't worry.
I think
it's fair to say, yeah.
I'm happy to confirm what you're saying, Councillor Rowbottom. There is a significant stream of work being undertaken at the moment by council officers. It's linked very much in with the return to the civic campus offices when they're completed, but is looking at the learning from COVID and where we work. It's looking more broadly actually than just the return to civic campus. It's looking at our accommodation more widely and our assets more widely. It's actually under the economy department, which deals with all of our property. Tony's got his hand up directed there, so may be able to give you a little bit more detail.
Brilliant, thanks, Emily. Tony, do go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Tony Clement, Strategic Director for Economy. Yeah, this is an area of work that's being led from Economy by our Assistant Director, David McNulty. So we are looking at all our assets, all our property, all our buildings in relation to moving back into the civic campus, but actually looking at all our holdings. We're taking forward some sort of tactical opportunities, if you like. So, for example, the any opportunities to lease space in the short term that that we don't need. The bigger piece of work is a complex one, and it is about some of the questions you raised, Chair, about what's the nature of the workforce and the way of working in the future. So some of that is determined or being worked on with our colleagues in people and talent. But that sort of interaction between how we work culturally as an organisation and what the buildings and physical space we need is very much underway, and we'd certainly welcome the opportunity to come back to the committee and talk more about it. But yeah, work in progress and a lot of development still to do.
Great, thanks, Tony. So I suppose in terms of the time,
Chair,
sorry,
can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah, do come in, Chris.
And I know there's a lot of work going on. I understand that, and who is responsible for delivering that piece of work to the council, to us, and by when?
I was just going to come on to that. I think if we've got a couple of dates in diary for our upcoming PAC meetings, but perhaps when we debrief as co-optees with all the co-optees next week, we can set out our themes for upcoming meetings and when you want an item on that, and whether you want to be involved in some of the more ongoing work and discussion on that. So perhaps if that's an area of particular interest, it'd be great to get you involved in that, and we can debrief next week. Does that sound all right?
Oh, thanks for talking me into a job. Thanks. Great.
There you go. That's the risk always, Chris. That's the risk.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'll come to Councillor. Oh, Councillor Rees, your hand. Yes, still up.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to come in on that last point. So working from home and the increase and the challenges and benefits of that is something we've covered on PSR PAC in relation to the response to COVID. But yeah, I mean, this is something we've spoken about in terms of future joint meetings. So yeah, I'm sure it is something that we'll be able to discuss in the future in more detail.
Great, noted. Thank you very much. And Judith, I see your hand's gone up there.
Yeah, it's a topic that we have actually touched on before in the PAC, and one of the things which I'd like to understand is what is the staff engagement in that work, because these things can get very driven by a demographic which is not necessarily representative of the workforce. So you have a bunch of old people like me making decisions which are not appropriate for a 21-year-old with a laptop on an ironing board. And I would like to know whether there was significant staff engagement. If I can give an example, and again, it's one that I've mentioned before. At the beginning of the COVID pandemic, Barclays Bank chairman, who's, a white middle-aged man, stood up and said, we don't think that we're going to need offices. Nobody's ever going to need an office again. Then a few months later, they actually did a staff engagement survey, and not one person said they wanted to work from home permanently. Not one in the whole of Barclays Bank. So it's really, really important when we're making financial decisions that we have staff engagement in that.
Excellent point, Judith. I think no one's, well, I certainly wouldn't be putting forward anything other than a hybrid model, because the in-person rapport that you get from working with other people is absolutely key. But let me pause there, because I don't know whether, Tony, you might want to come in about the process that's been happening so far, whether it's just a sort of review of assets or what that might look like in terms of staff engagement, which is, I would agree, absolutely essential.
Yeah, so obviously it's an interaction between what we physically have and what we physically need, and the workforce operation going forward, and staff engagement is absolutely critical to it. I mean, part of what defines sort of fit for purpose workspace is what enables staff to work well. So there'll be ongoing engagement with staff in this process, but also some of the issues that have come up in this conversation have already been live issues in discussion with SLT and other colleagues. Particularly some of our younger workers with particular needs. We certainly are not going into this with an assumption that it's very easy for everyone to work at home and it suits everyone. That's certainly not the council's learning from COVID to date.
Thanks, Tony. If we can just notice an action that we're going to have a sort of overview of that engagement, which I'm sure is sort of underway already, as you've said, but that would be really useful to have that as part of the work that we do. Judith, was that hand up again, or was that not taken down? Or did you want to come back on that?
I didn't realise I had to take it down. I use Zoom.
Don't worry. Yeah, it's a bit of a Teams glitch. Maybe they'll improve that in the future. But Councillor Quigley.
Hi, Helen. I just want to kind of support what Judith was saying, because I think it's really important that we take into account staff well-being, and to have a healthy, a happy staff, have a happy workforce. Therefore, they'll do their job better. But I also think, from just speaking from a councillor, that also for all councillors, all 46 councillors, they also need to be able to come in and interact with council staff and also the residents. So I think it's a whole picture we need to look at when we get to there.
Certainly. Thank you so much, Patricia. I couldn't agree more. Eric.
This isn't about this subject, so I don't know if anyone wants to talk any more about this particular subject. But it was just we've been facing a problem with budgets for a number of years because of course, we've lost a lot of our funding. Previously, the leader of the council mentioned that we would be a council tax freeze, and due to the fact that the people that are most vulnerable will be affected by a council tax rise. Now, obviously, we've got various funds in place to try and mitigate that, but it seems as if the strategy in relation to bridging that gap is now changed. Council tax increases are allowed, and so
you're just breaking up a little bit, Eric. I just don't want to miss what you're saying.
Okay, so my question would be: is it possible to get a cabinet member or the leader to talk a bit more about his strategy when it comes to council tax rises and what is and what isn't allowed in his vision? Because obviously the strategy has changed.
Yeah, certainly. I'll note that as an action, and I know that obviously while it's sort of gone up, the as you sort of alluded to, the council tax exemption scheme that we have for those most vulnerable is very much still running. But I don't know if any officers want to come in just to give a top line on that, and we can take away an action to go into that in a bit more detail, and possibly in the spirit of I think it was Tony's earlier statement, have a sort of explainer on that online, if that would be helpful.
I'll just comment briefly, I guess, and I can't talk on behalf of the administration, and I wouldn't want to. And clearly, council tax is a political decision, so I can't answer the administration's policy or strategy essentially on council tax. What I would say from an officer perspective is, as I explained as I went through the presentation, the government's expectations on local government spending power, so the funding that is available to local governments, when it talks about funding increases in local government, expects those increases in council tax. As I set out in the presentation, when government announced a 4.5% increase in spending power for local government, it expected the maximum council tax raises before the referendum limit. So there is a referendum limit to raise council tax, at which a local council would need to go to a referendum. But beneath that, the local government spending power calculations expects local government to raise to those maximum levels. So from an officer's perspective, the core spending power and government expectations are that you would increase council tax, but council tax clearly is a political decision, and any strategy would need to be answered by the administration.
Certainly, fair point, Emily. Thank you very much. Eric, did you want to come back on? Yeah.
Yeah, just on that point, Emily. In 2018, the expectation was 6%, and the council still froze council tax. So there has definitely been a change in strategy, and obviously it's welcome, because there was another thing. There is a gap, and the gap is getting ever wider. But would it be helpful? And I totally agree, Emily. This is not something for the officers. This is a political level, and the requisite people from the political side should be answering such a change or review of strategy.
Certainly, thank you. And I'll bring in Adam.
Good evening. Sorry, just as the Cabinet Member for Public Services Reform, I just thought I'd respond very briefly to your point, Eric. I can't speak on behalf of the leader, but what I would say is that I think what we've seen from the government in terms of funding levels for local government since 2010, as Emily has set out, and the uncertainty with regards to spending reviews, means that we haven't seen a long-term strategy from the government around council tax levels, and that makes it very hard for local authorities, including our own, to set out a long-term strategy about council tax levels. And we are clearly, as you know, in challenging financial circumstances with relation to the continued cuts to government funding, and the policy responses that we have available to us in such circumstances include raising council tax to a certain threshold in order to respond to those challenges. So I'll probably leave it there for now, and suggest that Councillor Schmid might be best placed to answer in the future as the Cabinet Member for Finance. But yeah, my point would be that yeah, we need some security and long-term funding plan from the government in order for us to be able to have a long-term strategy in relation to council tax.
Thank you very much, Councillor Connell. Eric, any final responses on that, or can we pick that up?
No, I mean, with respect, I think it would be very helpful to have Councillor Schmidt and Councillor Cowan talk about this, because the government, I totally agree, the government has not produced a long term, but has produced each year an expectation, and the current administration has decided not to implement that for very, very good reason. But that was a decision, and it did lead to certain elements, and there has now been a change in that decision making. So it'd be very useful if we're looking at medium-term finance, which is what today's meeting is all about, that we address that and we understand what the plan is going forward. So yeah, it would be great to invite those two.
Certainly, perfectly reasonable. I know that Councillor Smith has an absolutely exceptional excuses in not being here this evening, as his wife is currently gone into labour. But I am sure that he will be very, very happy to join, and we can put something written out on that, which I'm sure we could get to you most immediately, Eric. And if you felt it was good to have it as a future item as well, it's such a key question, and very happy to take that as an item for a future meeting. I'm mindful of the time and the sort of energy levels, I suppose. So unless there's anything sort of burning that people want to bring up now, I might sort of move to summarising actions and closing. Is there anything that I can't see any hands going up? So I'm going to summarise the actions taken forward. So I've got Tony's point about a summary of what's the more that you get for your money, and the sort of level of information that you could talk to your neighbour about as a sort of top line of the benefits. I've got the point that I think it was Chris made around commercialisation and the kind of opportunities around there and some of the costs in more detail. Eric's point about Brexit and market opportunities around this, and particularly how we can attract people to Hammersmith still, which I think links in quite neatly with the industrial strategy. So Eric, we can definitely pick this up. Chris's point about translating some of the local government finances and the stats into a kind of everyday finance language, and a summary of our zero-based budgeting focus, which is sort of in the report, but make that a bit more explicit so that we know what the, I suppose, approach is. And also an action for finance to send over some of the resident services costs over in more detail to certainly Chris and other co-optees if they're interested. And then lots of people have mentioned this contingency around the numbers tonight, particularly we've had the civic campus come up a number of times in relation to risk and opportunities. And we would, I think we've all sort of agreed offline that we'd like to focus on that with a working group in a bit more detail. So I hope to be in touch with more detail on that shortly. And also whether we can bring some of the revenue and savings outlined in the report in to life with some case studies and some impact. So we can look to that as a review of how we present the finances in future. As we've just had, the council tax increase is a kind of explanation of this strategy and all of the rationale, and particularly being very clear about the moves we've made to make sure that the most vulnerable are sort of not affected by this, and all the financial support we provide to those residents, particularly during the strains of COVID. We've had a detailed discussion, or rather the start of a discussion about the future of work for the council and the implications on space. And we want to engage our staff as a #1 priority in this process. And I think a more general sort of action and sort of broader point for development for the committee will be this ongoing policy development mentioned, and co-optees and residents are obviously key to this. We've had a lot on social care being key to COVID and also to finances. So I know that we're still, in terms of a future funding settlement, we've had a long awaited green paper on this. And I was almost going to say I would be surprised if it doesn't get the focus it's deserved after COVID settles, given that the public is now, I think, a lot more aware about social care and what it does, and that it's distinct from the NHS. But it's been kicked into long grass so much by the government that I also wouldn't be surprised if that happened again. But as a council, we can certainly seek to focus on something quite bold within the funding or the models that we're using. So if we could note those all as actions to take up in future meetings, that would be great. And I'll possibly just close by thanking officers and sort of the members and co-optees for all of your contributions during this meeting and the hard work that I know continues to go into what's, as a sort of period of time, very busy and, oddly, in a lived way, strangely slow at the moment. So thank you for persevering with that work. I also think it's worth reflecting that we are obviously meeting at the aftermath of what's hopefully our worst peak, or just at the tipping point of the worst peak of the pandemic in health terms, but that the financial impact of this will lag for a significant amount of time. As we know, we're now well into another recession. A rather gloomy stat, we've got since March last year, the unemployment figures in Hammersmith and Fulham have gone from 5 to 10,000. So when the furlough scheme ends, there's potential for that to shoot up further. So the business failures, the impact on the economy are all going to be significant. So we've got a big task ahead. And I suppose a final reflection, we're therefore going to need to be sharp and innovative and really have our eyes open or continue to do this in terms of our response. And this committee and the work it does both in meetings but also between it, I think, can play a key role in doing that. So I just wanted to leave on that note and thank everyone very much and wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Helen.
Thanks, Helen. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen.
Bye.